Honey, I blew up the business.
Welcome to the podcast. We have Fred Schmidt MBE dialing in from Austin, Texas. Nice to see you, Fred. How are you doing today?
Good to be with you, Dan. I'm doing great.
Well, I've got a really great conversation lined up for you today because we have in the house Austin's third biggest legend, in my opinion, after Joe Rogan and Alex Jones. Fred Schmidt MBE is the biggest legend out of Austin, Texas for me, because I've got a very fond memories of meeting Fred, which we'll get into. And he's a great entrepreneur over a multiple decade career, 30-year entrepreneurial career in a games, music, retail, tech. And particularly in a world I'm in often is the world of tech startups, which I think we'll hopefully get into at some point. And he's somewhat of an international ambassador between Austin, Texas, and particularly the UK, and particularly London, or Hackney in London. And actually, just after I first met him in 2017, he received an MBE from Her Majesty the Queen. Well, not exactly, but he got an MBE for his services as Director of International Affairs at Capital Factory in Austin, which I believe is the center of gravity for entrepreneurs in Texas. And he's led this formal relationship between the London Borough of Hackney and the city of Austin. So he's been a real connector, as Fred, and a real great guy. And I'm really excited to get into it with him. But just to remind you before we get started that this podcast is brought to you by my company, The Tech Department, which is the one that I blew up in a bad way, and which we turned around, and thank goodness we did, because I like working at the tech department, and it's doing better than ever. And the reason we're doing this podcast is to share that story and help you as an entrepreneur avoid some of the mistakes I made and learn from our collective experiences, so you can create an amazing business. So if you like our mission, you like what we're up to, please share the podcast and subscribe and rate it 5 stars on Apple and all that, because it does help. But let's get into it. I'm going to get right back to where we first met, actually, which was March 2017, which was a few months before I realized my business was about to blow up. Could you just tell the listeners, Fred, the context of how we first met?
I would be happy to do that, Dan. So, yes, it was in a pop-up venue at South by Southwest Interactive that Britain does on occasion. It started out with Hackney houses in 2013 and 14, went on hiatus for a bit, and then came back as Great Britain House. And so Great Britain House is the takeover of a 3-story pub venue in downtown Austin. And on the main stage, early in the morning before most people were awake, the MBE ceremony long distance took place. And that was where, because the kind of MBE the Crown gives to foreigners does not come with it an invitation to Buckingham Palace, which was the only disappointing part of the whole thing. I mean, it's a huge honor, was completely unexpected, and is, hugely valued, but foreigners, you don't get the invitation. It's just sort of like sent over to you in some way, but they wanted to do something. So they had the Consul General of the South Central United States present me with the MBE at Great Britain House during South by Southwest Interactive on the main stage to a very small group of people. And so that is what kicked off my morning, was this, huge honor in a place that I truly call home, which was, at that moment, Great Britain in Austin. So that took place. I was coming down from that experience of the morning, and then suddenly you appeared as, the promoter, if you will, of a wrestling competition with the Bakewell boys that, sponsored by the tech department, and it was called the Tech Off. And you asked if I would participate in about an hour or so out in the streets of Austin, on the main street, the high street of downtown Austin, in a Tech Off competition where we're publicly speaking, and I'm debating with another person who you found that day in Great Britain House, Tim Harper, who is another complete animal. And so you guys, with cameras rolling, and I'm sure the footage is somewhere, set Tim and I up into doing like a 5-minute extemporaneous speech in the streets of Austin with a crowd forming, these wrestlers around us, and we're speaking on some topic that we're passionate about. And I think I was talking about immigration or immigrants' roles in entrepreneurship and how we need to allow immigrants into our countries and yada, yada. But anyway, so we had these passionate speeches. And then at the end, the crowd was asked to vote and cheering took place. And I ended up winning that particular tech off, for which I was awarded. I mean, your listeners can't see this, but you and I are on video at the moment. So I have here in my hand the giant wrestling belt that I was awarded through that whole effort that says the Tech Off Street Fight South by Southwest 2017. And it's a giant wrestling belt. So that was the midsection of my day. And that was followed then by the two founders of the Poke advertising agency in London, who were in town and felt that the MBE presentation that I was given at Great Britain House that morning was not ceremonious enough. And so the two Nicks, Nicholas Roop and Nick Farnhill, arranged for me to report to a pub around the corner a short time later. And while a mariachi band was playing, out came the king, which is Nick Roop, King Roop, as we call him now, who went to a local costume shop, got full king garb, put it on, and proceeded to knight me in the pub over pints with a mariachi band playing. So this is, like, I have to say, one of the most epic days of my entire life and my career, Dan, and you are the centerpiece of the whole thing. That bridged from a real MBE to a knighting was a tech off with you in the streets of Austin. So memorable, to say the least.
Yeah, that was an amazing day, and actually quite a serendipitous moment, really, because we sort of, I remember on the day I had this, for listeners' benefit, we have spoken about this on the podcast before. I used to host an event called The Tech Off in London, which was known as the love child of TED Talks and WWE wrestling. And we were invited to take it to Austin, Texas for, as you say, South by Southwest Interactive. And we had this bullshit backstory we'd created that the Tech Off was invented on the streets of Detroit, where entrepreneurs would fight for money. And as it happens, Fred is from Detroit. So I actually said this to Fred on the day, and he said, "I'm from Detroit." And I thought, oh, bloody hell, he's going to like call me out. But then, so the whole thing was like a total fever dream of crazy ideas. But it was interesting how it did spark a kind of relationship that's lasted amongst all three of us who were participating and around it for many, many years. And that's why I was so excited to have you here, because the passion you had on that day, particularly around connecting, building bridges across between different communities, and you talk about immigration there, and I know you are an immigrant yourself going into the US. Now, it was just really a beautiful moment. And now, what I'm curious about actually is that sort of you ended up on stage, and we had this crazy experience together on that day, and you had these different experiences. What led up to you getting that MBE? What was it that kind of got you the award?
Well, that was that piece that you touched upon that involves Hackney. Okay, so in 2012, prior to the Olympics in London, I was invited by UK Trade and Investment at that time. It now is Department of International Trade, to go on a digital trade mission from Texas to the UK. And the purpose was to kind of see what was going on in entrepreneurial London at that time, and particularly in the East End. And I'm going, well, geez, I've been doing business in Europe and specifically in the UK for 30 years. I've been, all over the country and all over London. I mean, I've been traveling there since a teenager and know it like my second city. And so I'm going, but I've never been to the East End. I don't know what's going on there. And they said, well, that was the home of Tech City. I'm going, I've never heard of Tech City. So I Googled Tech City. There is no such place. There is nothing. It's like it was created in the Cameron administration as there to give it a brand and a presence of this emerging tech and creative scene that had moved from Soho and the traditional commercial areas of London eastward, as it has done in many places over the years through gentrification and rising costs. All the creatives and entrepreneurs are pushed out of the mainstream areas and cities, and everybody migrated eastward to Shoreditch. And so, I was asking people, I've got a lot of British friends, and I was going, so what's going on in Shoreditch and in Hackney? And many of them who live in the US also had no idea. And they go, why would you go to Hackney? Hackney's a complete shithole. Nobody goes to Hackney. I'm going, okay, well, that makes me curious. They're going, it's like a lot like Detroit. It's a rough area. You've got to be careful there. Well, I went on this digital trade mission with 10 other tech CEOs. I was a CEO of my last video game company at that time. And so went in that capacity. And so for 4 days, we were driven all around London to all the traditional areas. We were staying in East London, but we were driven to all the areas that I know very well. And I'm going, well, what about this East London bit? And, I want to really understand what's going on there. That's why we're here. And so on the very last day, the very last thing our official delegation did was we were marched up to the offices of Mother London Agency at the top of the Tea and Biscuit building, just below Soho House there, and across from Shoreditch High Street Station. And there, a ceremony took place that wasn't even on our agenda. We had no idea what it was about. And it was the formal twinning, a sister cities relationship between the mayor of Austin, who was part of our delegation, and the then mayor of Hackney, Jules Pipe, who is now in Sadiq Khan's administration as the head of, business and, jobs and things like that. And so our two mayors signed this agreement, and we had this string of presentations from amazing, brilliant people. And I'm going, this is why I'm here. These are the people I want to meet. And so, it was this lineup of all these tech and creative individuals from Shoreditch, and that was it. And so at the end, the two mayors are over on the side talking to each other, and a friend of mine and I picked up the agreement that they had just signed and read through it and going, okay. So I walked over to the mayors and held up the agreement and I go, so who's going to do all this stuff? And they looked at each other, looked at me, looked at each other, and they go, you are. And so by asking that, simple question, I sort of was informally appointed to somehow bring alive this sister cities relationship that these two mayors signed without really a plan to back it up. And so I, being who I am, I dove into it. I go, well, this should be fun. This is interesting. And so we were set to go back to Texas the next morning. And I got up at 5 o'clock in the morning, in preparation to go catch my flight at Heathrow. And I thought, I can't leave. I'm not ready to leave. I need to know more. And so I emailed several of the people who I had met at that ceremony the prior day and said, look, I've just postponed my flight by a couple of days. I'm sticking around. Everybody else is leaving. If any of you have any time and would like to visit with me, show me around Shoreditch a little bit more, take me for a deep dive, I'm here. And so I went down, had breakfast. And by the time I got done with breakfast, I had one amazing individual named Duncan Ray, who is a city builder and a bridge builder. And he was the Shoreditch town manager for the borough of Hackney. And he met me at breakfast and said, let's go. And so Duncan cleared out his schedule and he took me on a deep dive for basically 2 full days into the heart of Shoreditch. I mean, we went and visited co-working spaces, that's where I met Charles Armstrong at the Trampery, one of the earliest co-working spaces in London, amazing entrepreneur and creative individual. We went to so many different places, in the cultural life, and hit pubs and went for a full crawl all around, went up to Dalston and, all kinds of areas around the borough. And I just fell in love with the place. I said, this is going to be fun. I get this. I mean, I grew up, again, in central Detroit, in the Polish community there, since I was born in Poland, as you mentioned, as an immigrant. And so I'm very familiar with rough areas and places in transition. And I took this on as kind of an amazing opportunity, and then spent several years, much of my own time and much of my own money while I'm still building businesses and working, developing this relationship. And so, the prior consul general at that time here in Texas was observing all of this activity going, wow, this guy's like really into it. What can we do for him? We can't like compensate him. He's doing it. This is a volunteer kind of thing. And so he goes, I know what we can do. We'll see if we can get him an MBE. And so for 2 years, this man and his staff in Houston worked through the processes, which are very complicated. I don't even understand them all, to apply for me to get this MBE. And so it was ultimately awarded in a very macro kind of way for services to UK-USA relations. Okay, that's what it actually says on the MBE document from Her Majesty. And I'm going, God, that's a lot of pressure. I mean, I was doing stuff between Austin and Hackney and a little broader between kind of, Hackney and all of Greater London and sort of Texas and the UK, but I'm going, not USA-UK relations. I mean, I feel like I'm a diplomat, an ambassador. And so I always have felt like I need to lean into that more. I still have, I have more deliverables I owe to the Crown for that recognition and that award. And so, perhaps as we're talking about things, the story will continue, and I'll tell you kind of some of the last things that I was doing prior to the pandemic that literally fell right out of having received that recognition, because it's again still a huge honor and an amazing thing to receive, and it's rarely given to foreigners. So I'm neither British, nor did I do something on a national US-UK level, but I was given this very rare award, and I didn't even know what it was, and these days when people see the initials, which I use on occasion in certain contexts, when as I do more things actively with Britain, I use the MBE. Because you all know what that is, but in the US, people think it's like a master's of business education or something. So you have to explain it. But when I did the research, I'm going, wow, this is the same award, the same recognition that was given to the Beatles in 1964. Wow. They were made MBEs. I'm going, I'm not worthy. I'm not worthy. So that's the story there.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's amazing. I think there's a great sort of loads of interesting stuff in there about, I guess, paying it forward and actually the recognition. And it's funny because I think we can often be guilty of this, is just thinking, it's just little old me doing my thing. But you said something about leaning into it. And I think that's something to pursue. I think for all of us, just sort of leaning into the thing that you actually get recognized as being any good at. Just to pause on that a little bit. So you had this sort of story of, you've had this career in entrepreneurship in various different roles, and you've then spanned that out into this international ambassadorship sort of position. So it all sounds very rarefied. You're on international delegations and meeting with mayors and delaying flights and picking up awards. But like you said, you came from Detroit, and from perhaps that wasn't the world you were living in back then. Could you just give us a sketch? Because I'm interested to sort of almost like going back in time here. What was your experience in Detroit, and how did you get into the kind of entrepreneurial world?
That's a very long journey, a very long journey. I just did a presentation on that, a week ago to a group of college students who are, business students thinking of going into entrepreneurship, et cetera. And I'm actually also, since the pandemic, I've kind of reformatted my entire life that we'll talk about at some point, but I'm working on a book about my life and about my journey. And it's called From Refugee to MBE, okay? An Improbable Journey. And so what I do is I'm not because I'm important, Dan, not because I'm, all that, I'm this rarefied individual. I do have to point out, I am white, a white male, as are you. And that all by itself is an absolutely privileged position to start off anything with, okay? And so I try to remember that in everything that I do, and that even though I have experienced tremendous hardships at various points in my life, as we all do, whether it's blowing up the business or blowing up our lives or the pandemic blowing things up for everybody. Life is hard. I mean, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. But, I always have to come back to the fact that I've been able to rebound and I've been able to accomplish so many of the things beyond just my talent, my hard work and tenacity and so forth. It's because I'm also a white male. And that we need to reckon with. In the United States, in Britain, in all the places of historical power and conquest and, dominance over others, we need to make sure we remember to lift up all those other people. Okay. Mm-hmm. So that's something that's become really important and dear to my heart. And so I've kind of chronicled my life and my journey because it's just an interesting and an improbable journey, truly, of serendipitous events that occurred. So, my life actually started in Poland during the Cold War with a single mother in a little village that to this day still doesn't have a traffic light in Western Poland. And so after my grandmother passed away, my mother said, living in Poland, she's a concentration camp survivor and had a really difficult life from a life of great privilege. Her father, my grandfather, was a successful Polish scientist before the war, lost everything during the war. When my grandparents died, my mother made the decision, we're getting out of here. We're not living under, at that time it was not Stalin, one of the other guys after that, equally oppressive. But many parallels to what Ukraine is going through right now. And so we left there, we emigrated to Canada, which is the closest we could get to the United States. And we applied for political asylum in the US. So that's how I got to the US, is on a political asylum, award. Let's just say that's where the awards started. And so my mother and I ended up in Detroit because there's a large Polish community there. And she had a sister who before the war had already left and set up shop in Detroit. And so I started out in the Polish community in Detroit. By the time I was 14, my mother had married in the US, and my stepfather was 20 years older than her, and he fell ill with dementia and Alzheimer's when I was 14 years old. My mother didn't drive. She barely spoke English. I had a younger brother and sister at that time. At age 14, I was suddenly the head of the household. By age 16, my stepfather passed away. So I was like truly in charge. So I taught myself how to drive when I was 14. 2 years before I took my first driver's education course, I was already driving before I got my driver's license. And then I had to start working. So I had long hair and a long beard. So I started working in my high school years in factories in Detroit, because that's what you do. And that's where the good money was. Okay. And in that time, Dan, you have to understand that Detroit was basically Silicon Valley of the United States, of the industrial era. That's where all the money was. That's where everybody wanted to be. Detroit was the 5th largest city in the United States. It's now the 26th largest city. Wow. To show you how places can change and how times can really impact life. So I was working in the factories, earning good money to help support my mother and my younger brother and sister. And then one day, one of those events occur in your life that changes the course of your life. I was pressing bumpers for Chrysler Motors and stuck my hands into a giant press where, the machine comes and takes a flat piece of sheet metal, crunches it into a bumper that goes on the car, and you take that out and it goes off to the assembly line. Well, as I reached in, the die, which is a massive piece of metal, fell out, and my hands almost got cut off. I mean, they almost ended up in the die. I pulled my hands out just as that thing was crashing down, and my gloves, the tips of my gloves, were still stuck in that. Okay. Oof. I pulled my hands out, and this is like the 3rd factory job I had during those years. And I just said, that's it. I'm done. I am punching out. I've got a brain. I'm better than that. I've got to go. I'm going to the other side of the tracks and getting a white collar job. I'm done with the blue collar factory work. Then I realized, oh God, I just quit. I have no money now. What am I going to do? And so I ended up working in Detroit radio and in music, in Detroit music. And that's only because those are two things. Music I was passionate about, because Detroit at that time, the Motor City, was the home of a big classical music scene, the home of Motown, obviously, and also a giant burgeoning rock and roll scene that was happening. So this was in the early 70s, and it was Detroit rock and roll music merged with the British invasion. The British invasion was going full tilt. We were getting so many British bands coming in and just playing our clubs all the time. Little bands, like Led Zeppelin, and they were just club bands, and The Who and people like that.
Wow.
But we also had a Detroit rock and roll scene, and I ended up becoming a roadie for the MC5, which is the Motor City 5, and Iggy and the Stooges. Arguably, those two bands are highly influential in the formation of punk music, grunge, heavy metal, all of that. And then I ended up doing lights and sound for Alice Cooper. Okay.
Wow.
Just before he broke and became a national star. So I was doing that for fun and meeting all kinds of interesting people. And I was also working in Detroit radio on air as a personality. And the reason I was able to get that job is because when I was in school, I had a very heavy Polish accent, and I was constantly being beat up by the kids in school because they all thought, and their families thought, we were Russian. Okay. This is during the Cold War era. And so my mother got tired of having her child come home bloodied all the time. And so she sent me for broadcast elocution courses to rid me of my Polish accent, my Eastern European accent. And so, as you can tell, I have no accent. And with that training, it was only to get rid of my accent, but I learned these skills of a radio broadcaster. And so when I quit my factory job, I got a job in Detroit radio on air. And that literally changed my life into a career that I could then pursue in radio, in television, and cable television, ultimately ended up in video games, etc. But it was all because of that set of events in blue collar Detroit and those kinds of things that just intersect your life. The theme here being serendipity and fate, and how things come into your life that you don't plan, predict, or control. But the question is, how flexible are you? Are you open to these things? And can you, if you fall in the river, can you keep your head above the water, continue to breathe, and go with the current until you find calm water again? And so every time a calamity in my life, just like what you're describing, in this show and in your experiences, Dan, when bad things have happened to me, something better always has come out at the other end, and one piece of what you have to recognize, besides being a white male that gives you an advantage, is this thing called luck. Okay. Luck is the intersection of preparedness meeting opportunity. And when that happens, are you ready to take whatever is coming your way, even though you don't understand it? You got to jump off the cliff and go with fate and see where it takes you. And, my whole life, literally chapter after chapter, as I unfold this and unpack this, ostensibly for my kids, I'm writing this really for an audience of two, my son and daughter. So when I'm dead and gone, they, at this point in their lives, they have no interest in what dad's done and, why he's got an MBE and what is an MBE and all that stuff. I want to leave them with something, because I was never able to ask my mother, or I was able to, I never did ask my mother when she was alive about her life to the extent that I wish I knew today. And so I'm chronicling my life just as a shared experience for my kids and perhaps others, because when they hear my, again, unusual story, they all go, wow, that's crazy. That's a pretty epic journey. And again, it's not like I've got 10 million Twitter followers. I'm not Joe Rogan. I'm nothing like that. I am a South by Southwest street fighting champion, at the tech off. But it's only because I have allowed my life to unfold, and I've tried to take full advantage of the opportunities that have been presented to me to do the best I can with them, and that's some of that I attribute to my immigrant mentality, and humble starting point that, there's nowhere to go but up. And so it's up to you to kind of take it from there.
Interesting. Yeah. See, looking back and just reflecting on this, your improbable journey, as you'd call it, you mentioned that you've kind of taken the opportunity to, when bad things happen or difficult things happen, to kind of learn and sort of grow from that. Looking back over the last sort of 30 or even 40 years, are there any particular crisis moments that you kind of look back on and go, yeah, that was the ultimate, it felt the worst at the time, but ended up being the best for me overall? And what was that, and what did you learn?
Well, probably one of the next pivotal moments was I spent about 10 years in corporate work. I got a college degree while I was doing music and radio. I also got a job as a market research analyst, and so was able to start working professionally, and that led to a career that I won't belabor, but it's about 10 years that I spent, kind of on the job training, if you will, with my degree in communications and international business from Wayne State University in downtown Detroit. I was working full time during the day, going to school at that point at night. So I've basically worked, 100 hours a week since I was 15, 16 years old, either going to school and working and going to school, or being what I call a parallel entrepreneur. I mean, I have always, throughout my entire career, Dan, because if you look at my timelines, there, which is interesting, if you look at LinkedIn people's backgrounds these days, most people are now parallel entrepreneurs, okay? Meaning we're all doing like multiple things at the same time. You're still running the tech department and you're doing this, sensational podcast number 2 behind Joe Rogan in the world. Not quite that yet, but you're on your way.
Nearly, I'm going there, yeah.
You're after Joe. I've told him he lives right up the road. So, it's the ability to live life to the fullest is an important thing. And so I spent 10 years learning to apply what I had learned academically in the corporate world, to make sure I understood what a P&L really was, and what a balance sheet was, and how you do a budget, and how you go to meetings and make decisions and all that stuff. It was on the job training that other people were paying me for. And there were some really good gigs along that way. I happened to be, again, in the right place at the right time, and around the 1980 mark, where the market research company that I was working for had some very prestigious media clients. And so we were the market research firm that helped create the foundation primary research that created and launched MTV, HBO, CNN. Ted Turner was, the ultimate entrepreneur, was one of my clients. And so I had the privilege of being able to present a market research study to Ted at his offices in Atlanta, where he just, he got done writing our company a check for $100,000 for this media research study. And so we were there to do a presentation, and his big desk completely clear. He's in his chair leaning back, his boots up on the desk, smoking a big fat cigar. And so we all were sat in front of him, in a little row, and getting ready to start our presentation. He takes his boots down off the desk, leans on it, looks at us and goes, "Before you get started, let me tell you one thing. I don't believe in no fucking research." Okay. This was a starting point. And I'm going, wow, this guy just paid us $100,000. We're about to tell him what a 24-hour news station could be. And he just kind of threw all that right out the window, and let us know that he's an entrepreneur, by instinct, by gut feel. And, he wrote a book that's one of my Bibles called Lead, Follow, or Get Out of the Way, which is an appropriate thing to do. You got to pick your lane. All of them are good. The world needs everybody, whether you're leading, you're following, or you're just a bystander. The world needs everybody, but you got to pick which one you are going to be in, and really lean into that. So my epic corporate career came to an end. I was working in cable television in Washington, D.C. at the time as head of marketing. And I completed a survey sent out by the corporate CEO about how things were going in our cable television system, managerially, operationally, et cetera. And I'm a very honest and transparent person. And I'm going, well, the general manager is not real competent. I like him. I mean, we have beers together. He's a really nice guy, but I'm going, he's running a complete shit show here. I mean, the customers are unhappy. The politicians are unhappy. Everybody's unhappy. You might want to look into this. A week later, the general manager walks into my office, closes the door, and he goes, "You're fired." What? Why? What did I do? He goes, "Well, apparently you completed a survey for the company." I'm going, yes. I could see where this was going to be leading. I had no idea that he was the cousin of the CEO. So here I was like 30 years old, had my son, a new baby. We had just bought my first home, and I was out of a job. I even had a company car at that time, and they took my car away. And I mean, that was like, I was in tears for 2 days. I was in tears going, what am I going to do? I've got no job. I've got no income. Can't pay the mortgage. How am I going to raise my child? And I just said, okay, what am I going to do? So at that time, we didn't have Indeed and online job searches and all that. So I had out the newspaper and classified ads, and I was going through the classified ads, and I found a job that I applied for somebody to head marketing for a video software company. I'm going, what's a video software company? And my wife goes, that sounds like porn. I don't think you should apply for this. Please don't apply for this. This is porn. It's got to be video software. Well, I applied. I went for it anyway. I go, well, at the very least, this could be an interesting job interview. I got the interview. Turns out it's a video game company, what we then came to call video games. And it was with a company in suburban Washington, actually in the Baltimore area, called MicroProse Software. And the chief creative officer there and the co-founder is a guy named Sid Meier. And Sid Meier is the creator of Civilization, among many different products, but that was his biggest one. And I had the privilege of launching that game with MicroProse. And so the point of that story is I was fired. I had no job. I was in an industry that I didn't really love, the cable television industry, because they are really in the utility business. There was only a cable television industry because the phone company and power company were not smart enough to understand what cable television was and get into that business. And so other people did. But they were not in the entertainment and communication business. And that's the part that compelled me. I love fun. I love entertainment. Everything I try to do, I try to make sure it's something fun because life is short. I don't want to be working in the factory pressing bumpers my whole life. So everything that I have tried to do with my career, both corporately and entrepreneurially, I've tried to be in things that I know something about, I can contribute to, but that are also just fun businesses that in turn inspire me. Okay. And so when I left cable television, I found video games, and that turned out to be, the biggest career of my life, and became entrepreneurial because I first joined as part of a team of other founders. These weren't my ideas. I was an enabler, okay, for their ideas. So Sid Meier initially for his line of strategy and video games. Then I joined Origin Systems. It's a company whose products I brought into the UK. As a designated European, I was always told to set up our operations in Europe. You know about Europe, go set us up in Europe when it was time. And so I set up MicroProse Software in the UK and brought Origin's products, which were fantasy role play games. They were complementary to ours, into the market through our pipeline. Ended up getting to know those founders, Robert and Richard Garriott, a couple of brothers out of Austin, Texas, and they convinced me to leave MicroProse and join them. And so Richard Garriott is a legendary Hall of Fame game designer, and he's also the first second generation British American cosmonaut astronaut. Okay. And he's been a business partner of mine for most of the last 30 years in various ventures. You know, we've come together with others and built businesses, and then we've gone off and done other things. His things are more exciting than mine. He went and trained at Star City in the Soviet Union to become a cosmonaut, and launched himself with his own company he had to start to go up to the International Space Station, and spent 11 days up there doing work. And so very interesting individual. His nom de plume is Lord British. That's what he has created his games under, because he happened to be born in Cambridge while his father was a professor there. And that's when he dropped out of the University of Texas because he made $1 million on his first video game that was on a floppy disk and put into a baggie and sold, you know, in computer land stores. He goes, I think I'm going to do this, forget the education. So he's the least formally educated of any of the brilliant people in his family, but is arguably the most successful entrepreneur of any. And I've had the privilege throughout my career to work with individuals like that, Dan, which have always inspired me. And my role was always to help enable them to accomplish their vision and their goals, and help grow the business and so forth. And then those became learnings that I was able to take away when I finally became brave enough to say, hey, I've got a few ideas. I think I'm going to start some businesses. And so in the latter part of my career, that's what I have been doing. And those are still, interestingly, they're not the highest profile, the highest grossing, they're not public offering opportunities, but my businesses in retail have been some of the most enjoyable and the most enduring and durable of anything I've been involved in. You know, MicroProse, you know, went public and made itself extinct because it couldn't operate as a public company. Okay. Origin Systems, we sold to Electronic Arts, and is, you know, all that IP sits somewhere in the archives of Electronic Arts' vast vaults. All of the tech companies I was involved in, you know, are no longer, you know, at the front of the game. But my retail businesses, they've been around for 27 years now. And wow. You know, have endured, and they've diversified. We started out with a music lifestyle business that had a second offshoot that became a fashion boutique that is still around. So the music business is called Wild About Music. It's in downtown Detroit with a physical storefront on the high street, a block away from where we did the Tech Off, you know, street fighting event. And Austin Rocks is in Austin City Hall, right across from the W Hotel and Austin City Limits television studios. And then in 2014, I ended up accidentally showing up at an auction where a legendary toy store in Austin voted one of the top 10 toy stores in the world, right up there with Hamleys and others, independent toy store, was going out of business. It was going into bankruptcy. I showed up at an auction because some evil people were going to try to buy this. I wanted to make sure they didn't buy it. Somehow they dropped out of the auction, and I ended up buying the toy store. And so my wife and our team and I turned that around. And now we have 3 locations of that toy store, including one at the Austin airport. And so those businesses have been the most interesting and the most fun and challenging, and have endured through decades now. Okay. And the biggest challenge there came during the pandemic, where we very closely went out of business ourselves because everything, like everywhere, got shut down. And so I was doing 3 different jobs at that moment when the pandemic hit 2.5 years ago. And so my entire world at that moment, like for so many people, completely collapsed. Everything I was involved in shut down. And to be able to, you know, go through that dark time, I didn't blow anything up. Everything was going splendidly. But because of something that you could never foresee, none of us could, the pandemic is become the biggest challenger to survival that we have all learned a lot from. You know?
No, I agree with that. And Wow. I mean, we're coming towards the end of our time together on the podcast, and I'm just absorbing the kind of
You got
amazing.
to quit interviewing old guys, Dan, because we have decades of
I know, and I'm
stories.
like, which one do I pick? Like, exactly. Like, but it's so great
You
because
got
it
to
gives,
interview people that have only had a career for 10 years, and then the
exactly.
stories are fewer and shorter.
I need to up the length of the podcast. We'll do a proper Joe Rogan 4 hour special, perhaps. That's
There
what
you
that'll
go.
put it all in. Like, but you've had this amazing journey, and again, we've got a sketch here from the early days in Detroit. How you kind of got into sort of your career starting, the sort of looking at how it developed, and then this sort of point in the 2017 where we intersected, and the MBE and this amazing stuff that's come around, and then obviously with the pandemic and the challenges around retail. But looking back and reflecting on all of that, a question I like to ask in the podcast, I think is going to be an interesting one to ask you, and we've been dispensing wisdom somewhat here through your story. What advice should other entrepreneurs ignore? Out of everything you've learned and all this advice that you can give out, what should people ignore to progress?
It revolves around money. Okay, the ultimate double-edged sword of importance and evil. The prevailing thought is get other people's money, take as much of it as you can, and go spend it. Build something, create something. And I'm really a bootstrap kind of guy. I mean, I have had to raise venture capital. I've led a $7 million Series A raise with Portalarium, with Richard Garriott, my last partner in our last video game company. We've crowdfunded $12 million, even more than our Series A. And we still were not successful with that company in 3 rounds at bat. And it's been hugely disappointing, not because we didn't try. I mean, we had a great team, really worked hard, had 3 swings at the bat to create another round of legendary video games. We've been successful multiple times. We got the magic. Of course it's going to work. It didn't. And to this day, I still feel terrible because we lost other people's money. I lost a lot of my own money. So did Richard, but we lost other people's money. And that's a heavy burden to bear because I always pay my bills. I pay my debts. I try not to take advantage of situations. So again, my own businesses, I'm really not only proud of them for their endurance, but because we bootstrapped everything, Dan. We only have ourselves to account for. So if we're a failure, it's because of our own, bad decisions, circumstances, whatever. But I can go to sleep at night and not have to worry about other people. And so too many times entrepreneurs are urged and forced to just start to take money, especially, venture capital, which is unfriendly money by nature. That's, these are not people who generally are favorable to your business. They only have one mission, and that's to produce a return on investment to their limited partners. I understand that that's their business model, but that means if you're not, returning those funds on that treadmill and on a very tight timeline, you're not doing well. And they put huge pressure on entrepreneurs. So my advice is, again, it's worth exactly what you're paying for it, which is nothing. But my advice is avoid taking money until you absolutely have certainty that you know what you're doing, you have a product, and you're ready to scale. You can prove it because you've already been doing it for several years. You have profitability, and now you can take money only to do one thing, which is do more of what you're doing faster at scale. But you can already, except for something like the pandemic, of course, but you can predict where that ROI comes so that you can pay off and get out of that borrowed money essentially as fast as you can. Because the pressures that come with other people's money are massive, and I think lead to very unhealthy work environments, unhealthy lives, a lot of mental duress, something you're aware of and close to also, and make for a lot of really bad decisions too, that are not necessarily in the interests of your products, your staff, and your customers. So that's my biggest piece of advice there.
I think that's really great advice, and I think that's something that is well said, and I agree. I think there's a kind of I'm a bit of a bootstrap kind of guy, and there's a certain clarity to that. It's just sort of gets the making money, making profit is actually kind of quite a rigorous discipline that gets you get your stuff done right, and it means you orient yourself and align yourself on the most important stuff, like creating value. I would absolutely love to find myself in Texas again, because I had a ball in Austin. It's a great city, and I had a ball with you, and you're a great guy. So thank you so much for going on the podcast and sharing so openly. It's really great to connect properly. And I will be sort of following up on this, because the energy and the sort of enthusiasm you've got, I think, is really infectious and really, I think now we're coming out of this pandemic and things are settling down a bit. Let's rekindle some of these things and start making those those connections across the borders and building that out again from where we started in 2017.
Looking forward to it, my friend. Always a pleasure.
Well, thanks for listening, everybody. I'll see you all next time. Do you want to get the top 5 tidbits from each episode emailed to your inbox every Friday? Yes, you do. It saves you having to go through and make notes and make a note of all the books and all the ideas that are in the podcast. We go through and we choose the top 5 we like, plus put all the links into that email. So if you just go up to honeyblew-up-the-business.com, yes, that's honeyblew-up-the-business.com, and just enter your email address. There's a little box, just enter it in, and we will send you that information. And it saves you having to make notes and all that. That's make your life a bit easier. And of course, if you did enjoy the episode, please consider subscribing. We are trying to help people through this. So the more people that subscribe, review, rate on Apple, Google Podcasts, Spotify, the more people will see it, and the more we can help. So help us help other people, other entrepreneurs like you. And before I go, I've got to say big up to my company, the tech department, the company we blew up and put back together again. They're generously supporting me on this mission through the podcast. So if you guys want to have a look at a company that can really help you improve your technology, make it better so your business gets better too, boosting your sales and your profit and a bit more sanity in your life, a little less stress, then head up to thetechdept.com, the tech department. My company, give us a look. On behalf of all of us here, thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.